History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 3. The Classical Mediterranean. Chapter 5. Rome. The widening gap of the rich and poor in central Italy as peasant farming gave way to large estates bought and stocked with slaves, with the spoils of the empire and the new possibilities open to political soldiers, proved fatal to the republic in the end. At the end of the 2nd century BC, the Gracchi brothers, tribunes of the people, sought to do something about the social problem in the only way open to an agrarian economy by land reform, as well as by reducing senatorial power and giving the equities a bigger role in the government. They tried, in effect, to spread the wealth of empire, but their attempts only ended in their deaths. This itself marked the raising of the stakes in politics. In the last century of the Republic, factional bitterness reached its peak because politicians knew their lives might forfeit. It also saw the beginning of what has been called the Roman Revolution, for the conventions of Roman politics were set aside when Tiberius Gracchus, the elder brother, then consul, persuaded the plebs to unseat the tribune who had vetoed his land bill and thus announced that he would not accept the traditional circumvention of the popular will be by the prerogative of the tribune to use his veto. The final plunge of the Republic into confusion was precipitated in 112 BC by a new war when a North African king massacred a great number of Roman businessmen. Not long afterwards, a wave of barbarian invaders in the north threatened Roman rule in Gaul. The emergency brought forward the consul Marius, who dealt successfully with the enemies of the Republic, but at the cost of further constitutional innovation, for he was elected to the consulship for 5 years in succession. He was, in fact, the first of the series of warlords who were to dominate the last century of the Republic, for other wars rapidly followed. Demand grew for the extension of Roman citizenship to the other Latin and Italian states. In the end, these allies revolted in what is somewhat misleading, called the Social War in 90 BC. They were only pacified with concessions which made no nonsense of the notion that the Roman popular assemblies were the ultimate sovereign. Citizenship was extended to most of Italy. Then came the new Asian Wars, from which emerged another general with political ambitions. Sulla. There was civil war. Marius died after once more being consul, and Sulla returned to Rome in 82 BC to launch a dictatorship voted by the Senate with a ruthless proscription of his opponents, a posting of their names which signified that anyone who could do so was entitled to kill them, an assault on the popular powers of the Constitution, and an attempted restoration to those of the Senate. One former supporter and protege of Sulla was a young man whose name has passed into English as Pompey. Sulla had advanced his career by giving him posts normally held only by the consuls, and in 70 BC he was elected to that office too. He left for the east 3 years later to eliminate piracy from the Mediterranean and went on to conquer huge Asian territories in the wars against Pontus. Pompey's youth, success, and outstanding ability began to make him feared as a potential dictator. But the interplay of Roman politics was complicated. As the years passed, disorder increased in the capital and corruption in ruling centers. Fears of dictatorship were intensified, but the fears were those of one oligarchic fraction among several, and it was less and less clear where the danger lay. Moreover, one danger went long disregarded before people awoke to it. In 59 BC, another aristocrat, the nephew of Marasius, his wife, had been elected consul. This was the young Julius Caesar. For a time, he had cooperated with Pompey. The consulship led him to the command of the army of Gaul and a succession of brilliant campaigns in the next 7 years, ending in its complete conquest. Though he watched politics closely, these years kept Caesar away from Rome, where gangsterism, corruption, and murder disfigured public life and discredited the Senate. After them, he was enormously rich and had a loyal, superbly experienced, and confident army looking to him for the leadership, which would give them pay, promotion, and victory in the future. He was also a cool, patient, and ruthless man. There is a story of him joking and playing at dice with some pirates who captured him. One of his jokes was that he would crucify them when he was freed. The pirates laughed, but crucify them he did. Some senators suddenly became alarmed when this formidable man wished to remain in Gaul in command of his army, and the province, although its conquest was complete, retaining command until the consular election. His opponents strove to get him recalled to face charges about illegalities during his consulship. Caesar then took the step which, though neither he nor anyone else knew it, was the beginning of the end of the Republic. He led his army across the Rubicon, the boundary of his province, beginning to march, which brought him in the end to Rome. This was in January 49 BC. It was an act of treason, though he claimed to be defending the Republic against its enemies. In its extremity, the Senate called Pompey to defend the Republic. Without forces in Italy, Pompey withdrew across the Adriatic to raise an army. The consuls and most of the Senate went with him. Civil war was now inevitable. Caesar marched quickly to Spain to defeat 7 legions there, which were loyal to Pompey. They were then mildly treated in order to win over as many of the soldiers as possible. Ruthless and even cruel though he could be, mildness to his political opponents was politic and prudent. He did not propose to imitate Sulla, said Caesar. Then he went after Pompey, chasing him to Egypt, where he was murdered. Caesar stayed long enough to dabble in the Egyptian civil war and become, almost incidentally, the lover of the legendary Cleopatra. Then he went back to Rome to embark almost at once for Africa and defeat a Roman army there which opposed him. Finally, he returned again to Spain and destroyed a force raised by Pompey's sons. This was in 45 BC, 4 years after the crossing of the Rubicon. Brilliance like this was not just a matter of winning battles. Brief though Caesar's recent visits to Rome had been, he had organized his political support carefully and packed the Senate with his men. The victories brought him great honors and real power. He was voted dictator for life and became, in effect, a monarch in all but name. His power he used without much regard for the susceptibilities of politicians and without showing an imaginativeness which suggests his rule would have been successful in the long term. Although he imposed order in the Roman streets and undertook steps to end the power of the money lenders in politics. To one reform in particular, the future of Europe was to owe much: the introduction of the Julian calendar. Like much else we think of as Rome, it came from Hellenistic Alexandria, where an astronomer suggested to Caesar that the year of 365 days, with an extra day each fourth year, would make it possible to emerge from the complexities of the traditional Roman calendar. The new calendar began on 1st January 45 BC. 15 months later, Caesar was dead, struck down in the Senate on 15th March 44 BC, at the height of his success. His assassins' motives were complex. The timing was undoubtedly affected by the knowledge that he planned a great eastern campaign against the Parthians. Were he to join his army, it might be to return again in triumph, more unassailable than ever. There had been talk of a kingship. A Hellenistic despotism was envisioned by some. The complicated motives of his enemies were given respectability by the distaste some felt for the flagrant affront to the republic tradition in the de facto despotism of one man. Minor acts of disrespect for the Constitution antagonized others, and in the end, his assassins were a mixed bag of disappointed soldiers, entrusted oligarchs, and offended conservatives. His murderers had no answer to the problems which Caesar had not had the time and their predecessors had so conspicuously failed to solve, nor could they protect themselves for long. The republic was pronounced restored, but Caesar's acts were confirmed. There was a revulsion of feeling against the conspirators who soon had to flee the city. Within 2 years, they were dead, and Julius Caesar was proclaimed a god. The republic was moribund too, damaged fatally long before the crossing of the Rubicon. The heart had gone out of its constitution, whatever attempts were made to restore it. Yet its myths, its ideology, and forms lived on in a Romanized Italy. Romans could not bring themselves to turn their backs on the institutional heritage and admit that they had done it. When eventually they did, they had already ceased in all but name and aspiration to resemble the Romans of the Republic. Chapter 6, The Roman Achievement. If Greek contribution to civilization was essentially mental and spiritual, that of Rome was structural and practical. Its essence was the empire itself. Though no man is an empire, not even the great Alexander, its nature and government were to an astonishing degree the creation of one man of outstanding ability. Julius Caesar's great nephew and adopted heir, Octavian. Later, he was celebrated as Caesar Augustus. An age has been named after him. His name gave an adjective to posterity. Sometimes one has the feeling that he invented almost everything that characterized imperial Rome, from the new Praetorian Guard, which was the first military force stationed permanently in the capital, to the taxation of bachelors. One reason for this impression, though only one, is that he was a master of republic relations. Significantly more representations of him than of any other Roman emperor have come down to us. Though a Caesar, Octavian came of a junior branch. From Julius, he inherited at the age of 18 aristocratic connections, great wealth, and military support. For a time, he cooperated with one of Caesar's henchmen, Mark Antony, in a ferocious series of proscriptions to destroy the party which had murdered the great dictator. Mark Antony's departure to win victories in the East, failure to do so, and injudicious marriage to Cleopatra, Julius Caesar's sometime mistress, gave Octavian further opportunities. He fought in the name of republic against a threat that Antony might make a proconsular return, bringing Oriental monarchy in his baggage train. The victory of Actium, 31 BC, was followed by the legendary suicides of Antony and Cleopatra. The kingdom of the Ptolemies came to an end, and Egypt too was annexed as a province of Rome. This was the end of the civil war. Octavian returned to become consul. He had every card in his hand and judiciously refrained from playing them, leaving it to his opponents to recognize his strength. In 27 BC, he carried out what he called a republican restoration with the support of a Senate whose republican membership, purged and weakened by civil war, and proscription. He reconciled to his real primacy by his careful preservation of forms. He re established the reality of great uncle's power behind a facade of republican piety. He was imperator only by virtue of his command of the troops of the frontier province. But that was where the bulk of the legions were. As old soldiers of his and his great uncle's armies returned to retirement, they were duly settled on small holdings and were appropriately grateful. His consulship was prolonged from year to year, and in 27 BC, he was given the honorific title of Augustus, the name by which he is remembered. At Rome, though he was formally and usually called by his family name, or was identified as Princeps, first citizen. As the years passed, Augustus's power still grew. The Senate accorded him a right of interference in those provinces which it formerly ruled, that is, those where there was no need to keep a garrison army. He was voted the tribunican power. His special status was enhanced and formalized by a new recognition of his state, or dignitas, as the Romans called it. He sat between the two councils after his resignation from that office in 23 BC, and his business was given precedence in the agenda of the Senate. Finally, in 12 BC, he became Pontifex Maximus, the head of the official cult, as his great uncle had been. The forms of the republic, with their popular elections and senatorial elections, were maintained, but Augustus said who should be elected. The political reality masked by this supremacy was the rise to domination within the ruling class of men who owed their position to the Caesars. But the new elites were not to be allowed to behave like the old. The august and benevolent despotism regularized the provincial administration and army by putting them into obedient and salaried hands. The conscious resuscitation of republican tradition and festivals had a part to play in this too. Augustan government was heavily tinged with concern for moral revival. The virtues of ancient Rome seemed to some to live again. Ovid, a poet of pleasure and love, was packed off to exile in the Black Sea when a sexual scandal at the edge of the imperial family provided an excuse. When to this official austerity is added the peace which marked most of the reign and the great visible monuments of the Roman architects and engineers, the reputation of the Augustan age is hardly surprising. After his death in 14 AD, Augustus was deified as Julius Caesar had been. Augustus intended to be succeeded by a member of his own family. Although he respected republican forms and they were to endure with remarkable tenacity, Rome was now really a monarchy. This was demonstrated by the succession of five members of the same family. Augustus's only child was a daughter. His immediate successor was his adopted stepson, Tiberius, one of his daughter's three husbands. The last of his descendants to reign was Nero, who died in 68 AD. The rulers of the classical world did not usually live easy lives. Some Roman emperors had great mirrors installed at the corners of the corridors of their palaces so that their would be assassins could not lurk around them. Tiberius himself may not have died a natural death, and none of his four successors did. The fact is significant of the weaknesses inherent in Augustus's legacy. There was still scope for pinpricks from a Senate which formally continued to appoint the first magistrate, and always room for intrigue and cabal about the court and imperial household. Yet, the Senate could never hope to recover authority, for the ultimate basis of power was always military. If there was confusion and indecision at the center, then the soldiers could decide. This was what happened in the first great burst of civil war to shake the empire, in the year of the four emperors, AD 16, from which there emerged Vespasian, the grandson of a centurion and far from an aristocrat. The first magistracy had passed out of the hands of the great Roman families. When Vespasian's younger son was murdered in 96 AD, this upstart house came to an end. Its successor was an elderly senator, Nerva. He solved the problem of succession by breaking with attempts to endure natural dynastic continuity. Instead, he institutionalized the practice of adoption to which Augustus had been driven. The result was a succession of four emperors: Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, who gave the empire a century of good government. It has been named after the third of them, the Age of Antonines. All of them came of families with provincial roots. They were evidence of the degree to which the empire was a cosmopolitan reality, the framework of the post Hellenistic world of the West, and not merely the property of the Italian born. Adoption made it easier to find candidates upon whom army, provinces, and senate could agree. But this golden age came to an end with a reversion to the hereditary principle, the succession of Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius. He was murdered in 192 AD, and there appeared to be a repetition of 69 AD when, in the following year, there were again four emperors, each acclaimed by his own army. The Illyrian army prevailed in the end, imposing an African general. Other and later emperors were to be the nominees of soldiers too. Bad times lay ahead. By this time, the emperors ruled a far larger area than had Augustus. In the north, Julius Caesar had carried out reconnaissance into Britain and Germany, but had left Gaul with the Channel and the Rhine as its frontiers. Augustus pressed into Germany and also up to the Danube from the south. The Danube eventually became the frontier of the empire, but incursions beyond the Rhine were less successful and the frontier was not stabilized on the Elbe as Augustus had hoped. Instead, a grave shock had been given to Roman confidence in 9 AD, when the Teutonic tribes led by Arminius, in whom later Germans were to see a national hero, destroyed three legions. The ground was never recovered, nor the legions, for their numbers were thought so ill omened that they never again appear in the army lists. Eight remained stationed along the Rhine, the most strongly held part of the frontier because of the dangers which lay beyond it. Elsewhere, Roman rule still advanced. In 43 AD, Claudius began the conquest of Britain, which was carried to its furthest enduring limit when Hadrian's Wall was built across the north as an effective boundary 40 or so years later. In 42 AD, Mauritania became a province. In the east, Trajan conquered Dacia, later Romania, in 105 AD, but this was more than a century and a half after a quarrel, which was to be long lasting, had begun in Asia. Rome had first faced Parthia on the Euphrates when Sulla's army campaigned there in 92 BC. Nothing of importance followed until 30 years later when Roman armies began to advance against Armenia. Two spheres of influence overlapped there, and Pompey at one moment arbitrated between the Armenian and Parthian kings in a boundary dispute. Then, in 54 BC, the Roman politician Crassus launched an invasion of Parthia across the Euphrates. Within a few weeks, he was dead and a Roman army of 40,000 destroyed. It was one of the worst military disasters of Roman history. Evidently, there was a great power in Asia. The Parthian army consisted of more than good mounted archers by this time. It also had heavy cavalry of unrivaled quality. The cataphracts, mail clad horsemen with their mounts mailed to, charging home with heavy lances. The fame of their great horses even awoke the envy of the distant Chinese. After this, the eastern frontier of the Euphrates was to remain undisturbed for a century. But the Parthians did not endear themselves to Rome. They dabbled in the politics of the civil war, harassing Syria and encouraging unrest among the Palestinian Jews. Mark Antony had to retreat in disgrace and distress to Armenia after losing 35,000 men in a disastrous campaign against them. But Parthia suffered more from internal divisions, and in 20 BC, Augustus was able to obtain the return of the Roman standards taken from Crassus and thankfully set aside any need to attack Parthia for reasons of honor. Yet the likelihood of conflict persisted, both because of the sensitivity with which each power regarded Armenia and because of the instability of Parthia's dynastic politics. One emperor, Trajan, conquered the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon and fought his way down to the Persian Gulf. But his successor, Hadrian, wisely consolidated Parthians by handing back much of his conquest. It was the Roman boast that their new subjects all benefited from the extension to them of the Pax Romana, the imperial peace which removed the threats of barbarian incursion or international strife. The claim has to be qualified by recognition of the violence with which many subject peoples resisted Roman rule and the bloodshed this cost. But there is something in it. Within the frontiers, there was order and peace, as never before. In some places, this permanently changed the patterns of settlement as new cities were founded in the east or descendants of Caesar's soldiers were settled in new military colonies in Gaul. Sometimes there were even more far reaching results. The adoption of the Rhine frontier permanently affected the history of Europe by its division of the Germanic peoples. Meanwhile, there took place everywhere, as things settled down, a gradual Romanization of local notables. They were encouraged to share a common civilization whose spread was made easier by the new swiftness of communication along the roads whose main purpose was the movement of the legions. Napoleon could not move couriers faster from Paris to Rome than could the emperors of the first century AD. The empire was a huge area and required the solution of problems of government which had not been faced by Greeks or solved by Persians. A complex bureaucracy appeared with remarkable scope. To cite one small example, the records of all officers of centurion rank and above, company commanders upwards as it were centralized at Rome. The corps of provincial civil servants was the administrative armature, sustained by a practical reliance for many places upon the army, which did much more than merely fight. Bureaucracy was controlled by the adoption of fairly limited aims. These were above all fiscal. If the taxes came in, then Roman rule did not want to interfere in other ways with the operation of local custom. Rome was tolerant. It would provide the setting within which the example of its civilization would wean barbarians from their native ways. The reform of the administrators had begun under Augustus. The Senate still appointed to many posts on an annual basis, but the emperor's legati, who acted for him in the frontier provinces, held office at his pleasure. All the evidence is that, whatever the means were by which it was achieved, The administration underwent a notable improvement under the empire by comparison with the corruption of the last century of the republic. It was much more centralized and integrated than the satrapy system of Persia. The cooperation of the subject peoples was tempted with a bait. First, the republic and then the empire had been extended by granting citizenship to wider and wider numbers of Rome's subjects. It was an important privilege, among other things, as the Acts of the Apostles remind us. It carried with it rights of appeal from local courts to the emperor at Rome. On the granting of citizenship could be based the winning of the loyalties of local notables. More and more non Romans make their appearance in the Senate and at Rome as the centuries pass. Finally, in 212 AD, citizenship was granted to all free subjects of the empire. This was an outstanding instance of Roman power of assimilation. The empire and the civilization it carried were unashamedly cosmopolitan. The administrative framework contained an astonishing variety of contrasts and diversities. They were held together not by an impartial despotism exercised by a Roman elite or a professional bureaucracy, but by a constitutional system which took local elites and Romanized them. From the 1st century AD, the senators themselves included only a dwindling number of men of Italian descent. Roman tolerance in this was diffused among other peoples. The empire was never a racial unity whose hierarchies were closed to non Italians. Only one of its peoples, the Jews, felt strongly about the retention of their distinction within it, and that distinction rested on religion and the practices associated with it.